Okay, well, welcome back for the last session, which is a panel session, and I'm really pleased we've got a really great lineup for the panel discussion this afternoon, which is really about what perhaps some of the challenges are of building responsible innovation into development of AI technologies and ICT in general. I'm going to ask each of the panel members to introduce themselves. So this half of the panel will be very quick. That half of the panel, who you haven't met yet, will take a little longer, and they'll have a bit more time to talk a little bit about their background, who they are, why they're here, and what they've been doing. So I think if we start now, I'll pass it over to Neil.
Hi, I'm Neil. I've just been talking to you before tea. I guess in terms of the exam question we were asked, I would go back to something I was talking about, which was my surprise that over 10 years, the things that the public have to say about responsible innovation have changed so little.
Can you pass it to me? Okay, so I just want you to introduce yourself to begin with, and then...
I've done it now.
You've done it. So, okay. That's it. Okay. So all right. So each panel member then will introduce themselves, and we'll have a little time then to talk about what they consider to be the most difficult challenge. Then pass it to the next panel member, and then we will open it up to the floor for you to ask questions. Does that sound sensible?
Take heed of what you hear.
So now I have to introduce
And say
okay, sure. Okay, so I'm Marina Dignum. I'm a professor of social and ethical artificial intelligence in Umeå University in Sweden since yesterday. Before that, I was in Delft in the Netherlands. Talking about the challenges on responsible innovation and responsible on AI, for me the biggest challenge is to translate or to transform these very abstract concepts of values and ethics and so on into something which can make sense from the machine perspective. If I start with an adult, which is actually what got me interested in all ethical and social aspects of AI, some 20 years ago I was involved in a European project in which we had to develop an expert system to determine the distribution of, it was not organs, but it was skin donations across Europe. And then one of the requirements for that project, it was that whatever we made, we shouldn't be discriminatory. So discrimination was a very big thing. And we as engineers, we thought, okay, we thought a lot about that, and we're really talking about making the system rightly. We did it very much. We thought, okay, if we don't really keep information about the age of the patients and other kinds of characteristics like that, we are taking into account that the system will never really be discriminating on age. And we develop all our system like that. Then talking about developing the right system, no, because the systems of which are about giving organ donations, they need to know the age of the patient. So this type of translations, what do we mean by discrimination, and what does it mean all the way down to the code that we write, and keep that type of translations open, discussable, participatory, to get everybody involved and understanding why it is translated in this way and not in that way. It's by sure the biggest challenge. And I talk already much more than what I should have. Sorry.
Marina Kleijn, Head of Analytical Services to Elsevier and in charge of our pro bono report on AI. For me, one of the biggest things is really making sure there is an equitable dialogue between members of society and research that surpasses the vast difference in both the amount of information people have and even the words that they use.
Hello, I'm Catherine Flick. I'm a reader in Computing and Social Responsibility at De Montfort University. And I really kind of work in that space where the rubber hits the road a bit. I take kind of quite theoretical sides of things and try to get industry to implement them, which has been an interesting challenge. And I think that's actually one of the big challenges because we're not really going to see a huge change in society in terms of moving towards more responsible innovation unless we get industry to implement it. And really the big issues that have come out of the projects that I've been involved in. So responsible industry first out, then Compass, which there's a poster of up there, and now Living Innovation, which is the new one we just started, is that getting buy-in from the top seems to be one of the big key aspects of actually getting companies to innovate responsibly. And it's very hard to also kind of get to those who would just feel that they're the puzzle solvers. So getting people who don't feel that perhaps this is appropriate for them to be thinking about to actually do that. And one of the other hats I wear is with I'm on the Committee on Professional Ethics for the Association of Computing Machinery, which is a very large professional organisation for computer scientists and anyone working meaningfully with computers. And we just rewrote their Code of Ethics, which was a really interesting thing because we got a whole lot of responses from the membership and also the general public about what the profession should look like in terms of ethical thinking. And a lot of this seems to be very much coming out of concerns about AI and where AI is going to lead us. And so I think there is sort of more of a shift in culture, but we need to make sure it goes from the top all the way down to the puzzle solvers who just like to fiddle with algorithms. And I think that's going to be a really good challenge to be able to appeal to all of those people along that line.
Hello, I'm Cecily Morrison and I work in this building. I'm a researcher in the Human Experience and Design team. And I work at I would say the boundary of human-computer interaction, AI, machine learning, computer vision, mostly around computer vision, and also in the spaces of healthcare and disability. And I think I sit in the middle of the projects looking at how we create algorithms, how we understand what people need, how we bring these two things together. And I think in this process, working in these multidisciplinary teams is really, as a team, trying to get our heads around what is fair. You know, if you create a technology that really enables someone with disability, but then perhaps captures someone in images, which as a society we've decided we don't really like, who hasn't given consent, what constitutes fair? You know, what do we as a society say as an inclusive society? If we create a technology which is inclusive and we decide we're an inclusive society, but we also decide we're a society that requires consent for every image taken, where's fair? And how do we put in design the ways that can make things fair? All down to the interactions that people have, to the algorithms that we build, what's fair. And we've been thinking about this from theoretical perspectives all the way down to the building of algorithms and the interaction design of the systems that we're doing. And I personally am very keen to have open this discussion as we start to think about these things in quite high-tech technologies with the general public in ways that are meaningful to them, not at a broad level, is this fair, but at a really meaningful level. If you had to choose between your child in a school allowing another child to have this technology or not, what would you choose and why?
Thank you. Hello everybody, I'm Jack Stilgoe from University College London, where I work in the Department for Science and Technology Studies, and I teach and research things to do with emerging technologies and science policy. I come at this as somebody who's sort of had a series of semi-accidental engagements with responsible innovation. So in 2011, I was part of the team that worked with EPSRC and ESRC to develop that framework that Neil put up earlier, and I ended up being, you know, when we're talking about responsible innovation in action, in practice, and what the actual issues are, I ended up being the embedded social scientist on that geoengineering project that Neil mentioned, looking at the very human aspects of what it means for those scientists to be, and let's face it, they were highly ambivalent about their own research project as well, which is part of what made that conversation so very interesting. And I mean, I ended up writing a whole book about that research project, which was probably more than anybody needed. But I thought it was quite an interesting case of responsible innovation in action. To Neil's point that what publics say about responsibility hasn't changed very much, I would certainly agree, because I think a lot of the lessons that we learned from the geoengineering case can be traced back to the genetically modified crops case, and we can pass them on to the AI example, and rather than trying to reinvent wheels, as is often done around these, there is a lot to be learned, contra Anthony Seldon, from the past. I would say so I am now, as with any bandwagon jumping STS person, there are lots of us, I'm now on the AI bandwagon as that one sails past. I'm a fellow of the Turing Institute. I've just got a big grant from ESRC to do some responsible innovation work on self-driving cars. My interest there is on taking what has been a very abstract debate and looking at the question of whether we might be able to anticipate how questions of justice play out in the real world, especially in the material world. Cars and transport are a very interesting test case because so much of this discussion has been software-based. And when software meets hardware, you start to get some interesting problematizing of some very lazy assumptions, as Virginia explained so nicely this morning. Just one aspect that I guess I would draw attention to give you my response to the essay question. And that's that when we talk about AI, the language of ethics and governance has become a bit too easily a part of the mainstream debate, which makes, in one way, ethics and governance people like me think, well, great, but also we worry. I worry that it becomes so very easy for powerful actors to say, well, we're doing this for the benefit of humanity. The language of beneficial AI is everywhere. There's a screen in the window that you would have walked past this morning that said that AI, according to the Microsoft vision, will be empowering. As a sociologist, I come at that and I say, for whom? Right? It's very, very easy to homogenize humanity. Very hard to ask the question, the ultimate question of public policy, which is who benefits? How do we make it so that with this aspect of science and technology, we don't exacerbate inequalities, but we actually realize some of the emancipatory potential of this technology? Often was talked about with geoengineering, was talked about with nanotechnology, was talked about with genetically modified crops, that this will somehow help the world's worst off. It doesn't happen on average. It sometimes happens in the particular, but we don't spend enough time thinking about the conditions through which that happens. So I guess my challenge is to engage with the question of power and equity. How do we take on board Anthony Seldon's point that technological change distributes its benefits highly unevenly? But then how do we go beyond what he said to actually problematize technology itself? Right? Rather than just taking technology for granted. How do we connect those two things together? That's my research question.
Great, thank you. Can you pass me this? Okay, so we have two mics down there, so you might want to distribute them a little bit more. Thank you very much for all those very interesting
Equality and distribution of mics.
What I'd like to do then is open it up to the floor now. If you have a question to ask, it would be good if you could say your name and perhaps your affiliation if you wish. And then if you wanted to direct to a particular member of the panel or you just want to open it up, please say that also. So I don't know if we have some questions now from the audience for this esteemed panel. Don't be shy. Tristan.
I am a little shy. Tristan Riley-Smith from Cambridge. I've got the honour of acting as a research integrator for a programme of research into transnational organised crime. One of the research projects out of Exeter is looking at the history of slavery in relation to modern slavery. And an interesting question that's emerged, which we hope is going to turn into a Ditchley Park conference in the future, is the relationship between technology and slavery. Because historically there are some really interesting examples of the way in which advances in technology actually ended up enslaving people. I'd be interested in just hearing the panel's views on where AI might go for better or worse when it comes to slavery.
Wow, okay. Would somebody like to tackle that one?
Keep on busy.
Jack?
I think there's a really interesting. I mean, I take it that the question there is a more literal question to do with technology and slavery. And normally, if somebody said to me technology and slavery, I would think just in terms of metaphor, because going back to
I'm not being
right.
metaphorical, but you can stretch the definition of slavery as far as you want.
Absolutely, but I think it is worth reflecting on the metaphor, that going back to Frankenstein, Allul, Heidegger, theories and cultural expositions of our relationship with technology have latched onto the idea of mastery and slavery quite quickly. And I think it's worth just engaging with that a little bit, because what it's getting at is something that, to my mind, is overlooked in conventional discussions of technology governance, where we might leap to questions of, say, risk and ethics. And the master-slave relationship immediately gets to a question of power, which has always been there, but rarely is the dominant policy discourse.
Catherine.
Go ahead. All right. So this is actually one of the things I've been doing with the ACM Code of Ethics. Was we responded to a lot of people's concerns about creating, like in the States, the Muslim registers and things like that. As so sort of using technology to oppress particular sectors of the population, which, I mean, we'll do a broad definition of perhaps the things that could lead potentially to slavery, right? But it's something that we definitely felt that we needed to include in this new the new code that we did, was to explicitly say not to create systems that will oppress certain groups of people. So certainly, we've come down quite. We think that's a very problematic thing. So
can you just remind me what code that is?
The ACM's Code of Ethics.
Okay.
So there's a poster about it up in so it's the recently updated code.
Okay. Cecily, I think, wanted to say.
I'd like to take a very specific example and maybe help us think about this in a different way, which is that a lot of this view of responsible innovation also focuses on sort of tech for good, this idea of the disability space. And I think this is an interesting space because I personally believe that technologies can transform the lives of many people with disabilities, but often not the way that people approach them. So a lot of money goes into this, and people go, "Oh, you can't see, so I'm going to build you a system that can see for you." And this to me is almost like that sort of technology and slavery. So we're trying to enable people, but actually we enslave them by having a system that walks them around like a dog. Whereas we can also think about, we can be much more subtle in the way that we design systems and think about, for example, with people with disabilities, they're very able, they're very capable of many things. How is it that we augment those capabilities? So if they're able to take in make many things around the world, regardless of what their senses are, how do we add to that sense making rather than replace the sense that we think is somehow missing? So I think in this distinction of design, we can move from a space where we actually, you might think of slavery, perhaps not in the way that you were thinking about, in the way that we have systems that take over people versus systems that really enable people. And I definitely applaud, technology moving in this space. I'm also very cautious and very worried when people go, "Oh, great, I'm going to make something for a disability and therefore it's going to be good."
Virginia.
Maybe offering a different perspective on the idea of slavery and AI. One of the proposals or of the ideas that have been discussed concerning the role and the position of artificial intelligence systems, and specifically of robots or intelligent robots as embedded versions or physical versions of AI systems, is to give them exactly the role of the slave. And by that, it would solve, or at least it's part of the discussion on that area, that by seeing the robot as having the position of the slave, that would kind of explain or enable a whole way of dealing with responsibility, dealing with accountability and so on, putting it on the masters of those robots, which would be then the people. So I'm not saying that that is something which is that I necessarily endorse or not, but it is a position which often comes as a way to deal with responsibility and accountability towards artifacts or robots.
If any of you have a response to anything that's been said by the panel members, or you want to add any more? Does that help you, Tristan? Do you have anything to add back to that?
I'll stay quiet for the moment, because I've got to go away and do a lot of thinking.
Okay.
Well, I mentioned one really interesting one which came out of Exeter. The sort of moral ambiguity of the idea of the sex. Is the sex robot good or bad?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Discuss, or don't discuss. That itself is a rather interesting moral dilemma.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Do you have any further questions? Thank you.
Yes, a lot of the times that we discuss about the ethics of artificial intelligence, we assume and take for granted that we have a democracy. Well, it's very European to start with. We don't think about Guatemala. We're thinking about a European political context without taking into account that might have war in 5 years, or we might have dictatorship in 5 years, and how what we plan about the development of AI, if we have suddenly a change of regime, what will happen then? And how do we safeguard ourselves from that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's a really good question.
Or the economic system as well, because we are talking within the context of a capitalistic generalist system, but what if we have communism tomorrow? Or another economic system.
Well, there's so much uncertainty, I think, even in Europe and in the West as well. So, who would like to have a go at that one? Thank you, Marie.
So, two things actually. One is, I think that a lot of this question is implicit in a lot of the stories you hear now about fake news.
Sorry, I can't hear you.
Is it on?
Yeah, it is on. So it's on. Yeah, can you hear me? Okay. A lot of the stories about the fake news address exactly this point. If those in power can change what we see as real news, and if people don't have quality signals anymore to distinguish things they can trust from things they don't trust. I think the example that Abigail gave this morning of the augmented pictures is an excellent example that shows people's ability to make that distinction get lost. So I think it is, on the one hand, a thing that is coming on. On the other hand, one of the things we're now talking a lot about AI, the underlying is the big data. AI works only in a big data context. A lot of the potential good or harm is based on the question who owns the data and who has access to that data and who can see that data. And I think a lot of the worry in Europe, and also a reason why GDPR was started, is because we see the power of the data going to the US and to China. And that's where then the economic power is, and where the, and with that economic power also the power to make the algorithms that make the decisions.
Oh, I'll take it, yeah. I think this power relationship is actually really important because it's about, we see basically there are just very large technology companies that have a lot of information about us and the capacity to actually do a lot with that information, and it's all very, very centralized. And I think that's a potential point of failure if we do have, say, regime change of some sort, right? And let's say tomorrow the government decides that Google has to suddenly work for them, or something. I think that there's a lot of I worry a lot about the centralization of data, and I worry a lot about these big tech companies which buy up lots of smaller companies that have different data, and then they're able to kind of So I think that this is. I think I actually very much agree with what you're saying. Is that it's maybe not so much about the specific political things, but it's about what might happen. Like what does this centralization of data and what power structures does this kind of enable, particularly when it comes to large companies and their relationships with various governments.
And Cecily, if you want to chat.
Yeah, you can.
Okay.
Cecily.
Bringing it back down to design, because I think, well, that's where I work, but also I think that's where a lot of these things can be addressed and maybe haven't been in the past. There's a lot we can do with design to think about how people whose data might be used can understand that and can manipulate that. And at the moment, we still have quite an antiquated structure where we somehow have this notion of consent. I consent up front. I don't really know what I consent to most of the time, and then my data happens as it is. But we can also think about designing systems where I have a much better understanding of what's going on with my data and how I might hide. I think of it a little bit like hide and seek. I can play hide and seek when I'm a kid. How do I start to learn to play hide and seek when I'm older? Now, if that's done without design, it feels a little bit like you're in a less democratic situation. But if we think about it as design, we think about it not as hide and seek, we think about it as feedback. How does the system give you feedback telling you what you do so you can make choices about what you do? So it's a very old thing, but in some sense we're not thinking as much about it as we can in machine learning systems to really help the users participate. And that can be on the user side, or it can be on the bystander side. It can be on a range of different stakeholders that we might need to consider more carefully and more thoroughly. And I also wonder if by spending so much time thinking around the data and where's the data, have we missed something that actually we can put people in much better control by having much better design of these systems.
If we go Jack and then Virginia and then
So your question makes me think slightly differently about democracy within innovation, because I think the important thing, the easy thing to do is to separate the world into democracies and authoritarian regimes. I see a world in which the case for democracy needs to be made again, in which public support for democracy is on the wane in lots of big democracies, and authoritarianism suddenly looks frighteningly popular. So as part of making a renewed case for democracy, I think one of the urgent questions is to consider what a genuinely democratic approach to innovation and progress might look like. And the reason why people like me connect things like democracy and innovation is because we see a problem in the way that technologies are allowed to develop, in that technocracy tends to often trump, verb, not noun, democracy. And so the squeezing out of democracy, I guess, is my problem. If you look at, AI, for example, I think we're just a world away from imagining any sort of genuinely democratic approach to that area of technology. So I think we do ourselves a disservice if we say, well, we are the good guys in the democracies, what if it got into the hands of the baddies? I think that's the wrong way of cutting up the world.
Who is we? Who is we?
Sorry, if we say we in democratic regimes in the West, if we divide the world into good actors and bad actors, this is a dominant way in which technology policy is thought about in terms of liberal democracies versus authoritarian regimes. And I think that's, we have no cause for such hubris when it comes to our own approaches to technology.
I actually would react more on what has been said here than directly on your question, but it's also related to your question. Firstly, we, all of us here and in the world, we don't have to equate AI with data. AI is much more than data, and the democratic thing there is to assume and to accept that there are many more ways to go about doing artificial intelligence work. Of course, now we are seeing a lot of the developments that we see at this moment are developments which come from a very specific type of paradigm in AI, which does that is based on identifying patterns on data, and we are seeing and are profiting at this moment from all the possibilities of what can be done by identifying patterns on data. Intelligence in itself is much more than identifying patterns on data, and the more and quicker we realize this, and the quicker we assume and we realize that identifying patterns on data is not the way that is going to solve all our problems, then the more democratic we can be, or the more diverse we can be in the ways that we are going to deal with artificial intelligence, but also with different problems. Artificial intelligence is also about reasoning, is about causality models, is about abstraction, is about all kinds of other things which at the moment we are not doing. I'm very concerned as a researcher in AI that I just got yesterday the numbers from the submissions for the next triple AI conference in January or February, which are 7,700 whatever, of which I suppose 99% will be yet another variation on yet another algorithm, on yet another gun or deep learning stuff thing. We are not, and we will be sorry, very much sorry for the fact that we are putting all our eggs in the same basket, which is the basket of the data. The data is the data that we as people generate ourselves, is biased by definition, has all kinds of problems by definition, and it's by definition from the past. It's always from the past. We need other ways to deal with intelligence, and that I think is one way to deal with the democratic. I get very annoyed. I've been too long on AI.
I'm with you.
Thank you.
I would actually just like to ask Neil if the research councils have any kind of view on that question, which is a very interesting one.
So she's blown my strategy of keeping quiet. I actually did have a comment I was going to make anyway, which is that if we actually took the attitude that something bad's going to happen, so we shouldn't be doing this, and allowed us to stop pursuing new knowledge, we'd have grown to a halt, not just as civilization, but as a planet quite a long time ago. We might be quite happy in our fields looking after whatever beasts we domesticated, but we wouldn't have got much further than that. We'd have all died by the time we were 30, if we were lucky. And so I think, so on one side, the short answer to your question, I don't think we have any choice, but to recognise that bad stuff will come at us from other people's clever stuff, but we have no choice in that situation but to run as fast as we can in pursuit of new knowledge, because it's only by getting better and understanding the world more deeply and finding ways to make data more democratic, if you want to bring it into the particular, to make the ability to control your data and not let other people have it, to destroy your data after it's escaped. That would be a nice one. There's a research project for you. Can anybody find a way of wiping me off the face of the planet in a digital way? But all of those kind of research questions will emerge, and they will only be, we have to invest in clever people doing clever things in pursuit of what we believe the right things are. But we also assume that they'll come back and bite us, because they will.
I think Jack might want to respond to that. I will open it up to...
Thank you, Neil. I mean, that was quite a fun. I mean, you would appreciate a caricature of a view of progress that is linear and in which the only task is to accelerate, or the only regulatory task would be to brake. And you will appreciate, as somebody within one of the research councils, that you also have a steering wheel. And your presentation earlier did a really nice job of explaining the subtlety with which that steering wheel can be used. Because if you were to take that model of progress that you just drew, you would be unable to, for example, ask questions about, well, who is benefiting from, say, the development of particular pharmaceuticals. You would also, so we would, for example, make worse a situation in which 90% of medical R&D was going on diseases that only affected 10% of the population. Right? Thankfully, we have recognised that inequity and started to correct it, recognising that progress has multiple possible directions. But you did something else that was quite interesting, which is that you elided stuff, which we could have take to be some form of technology, with knowledge, which we could take to be some form of science. And I think this has really important implications for how we think about responsibility, because it is often a rhetorical strategy that we justify our actions in terms of technological progress and then defend ourselves in terms of the freedom of scientific inquiry. And I think we have to be a bit more subtle than that. Otherwise, what we are doing is profoundly anti-democratic.
I'd actually argue it the other way around. I would actually say that I think there is nothing intrinsically bad in the pursuit of knowledge. And you might disagree with me, but I actually believe.
You started off by talking in terms of good stuff and bad stuff. So is stuff.
Yeah,
knowledge?
but I think you then need to recognise that you know, and I realise I'm dealing with an expert now, and I'm just an ungifted amateur. But what I understand about knowledge is once you've got it, it goes all over the place. You can't control it, and you can't control how it's used. And that's when the stuff comes back to bite you. But that's not a reason for not believing that one of the reasons we're on this planet is actually to learn and explore and pursue knowledge. That's my personal view. A sociologist telling me that the pursuit of knowledge is a bad thing is something I'll be able to take home to my sociologist wife this evening. See what she's got to say about it.
Let's be very clear that nobody said that.
I think that's right. You didn't say the pursuit of knowledge is a bad thing. But I think one of the things certainly that we have been discussing with funding councils is, can we sustain this progression now in terms of the planet, its resources, the ways in which we're moving, that acceleration? Can we just now go for knowledge for knowledge's sake, for the curiosity, as opposed to actually focusing and targeting on the specific grand challenges, which are some of the things that we are now focusing on. That pursuit of knowledge for knowledge's sake seems to be something that we are able to do less and less, I think. But maybe that was what you meant,
all I'm saying is that I would really worry if we decided that we were going to pull back from the pursuit of knowledge, because I think that's absolutely the wrong thing to do faced with any kind of a problem.
One more, and then I'll open it back out to the people in the audience.
But I mean, to bring this back to responsible innovation, I mean, this is where like the whole critical aspect of it is supposed to come in, right? So yes, we can pursue knowledge, but then we also need to be able to be critical of that pursuit and the way that, not just the knowledge, I mean, not the way that we go about pursuing the knowledge, but also what we do with that once we kind of find it, right? And I mean, I think that there's definitely a lot of space. It's not just an either or. There's a lot of space in between to be critical of this, and also to make criticism public as well, so that we have a healthy dialogue about what we as a society do with particular, outcomes of knowledge pursuit. Anyway.
Okay. Do you want to respond to that? We didn't mean to jump
No,
on
no.
you there.
Sorry.
That's fine.
Okay, there was one question up at the back there, so I'll take this one and then here and then over there. Thank you.
So this does slightly build on what you were just saying, and whilst I'm not Anthony Seddon and I'm not going to go back 65,000 years, there is a bit of more recent history that I wanted to raise. There's actually Jeff Walsham, who's an emeritus professor of the university just down the road, who in 2012 wrote a paper that said, "Are we making a better world with ICTs? Reflections on a future agenda for the IS field." Now, if you take AI as a particular form of IS, given that he said that in 2012, have we got a chance of making a better world with AI? And if so, better for whom?
Okay. Who would like to start there? Cecily.
I'm going to be positive. Yes, I think we have an opportunity to make a much more inclusive society. But we have to think about who's building that technology.
What she said.
Also what she said. But also I think it's like there's a lot of potential for AI. Like, so I talk to AI industry people quite a bit, and they they come at me with the whole "we don't want to be the next GM food" kind of thing. And I think the big thing is about the fact that we need to include society in the development of this stuff, because it's there seems to be a lot of narratives about AI that are completely fantastical. Like, I mean, you have people think about the Terminator, and they think about movies and things like that. And I think one of the big issues that we do have is that people have this idea of what AI should be like, and we actually need to be a bit more realistic with the general public, so we manage their expectations as well. And I think only when we start to do that properly are we going to actually be able to usefully work with them to develop stuff that's actually going to be beneficial to them, because otherwise they'll come at it with this idea, oh, well, you'll be able to solve all my problems and make me a robot that will clean my house for me and do all those sorts of things sometime in the future. But we're nowhere near anything like that. And I think management of expectations is really important.
When you talk about them, do you have an idea of the them that you're...
I mean anyone really. I mean me, you, people, like, it doesn't matter who really. It's anyone that's likely to be. I mean, because it'll basically any sort of person that's likely to be impacted by artificial, like any of the AI outputs, whether they're physical, robot style outputs, or impacted by software decision making that means they can't get a loan from a bank or something like that. It's about managing expectations and also just being very factual about what it is that AI can and can't do. And I think even just I get into conversations with people who work in AI, and we have arguments about AI versus ML and all that, machine learning, and I think even just the nomenclature we have for this is actually really quite problematic at the moment as well, in terms of the communication that we have about what it can and can't do as well. So, yeah.
Do you think that benefiting some them is going to automatically disadvantage some other them, though?
Well, at the moment, yes, probably. I don't think it has to, but it probably will at the moment.
Okay, Virginia? Shortly, yes, I think it's doing some good to someone. The issues, just what I would like to add is that, firstly, I don't think that AI is just a new kind of, or just a part of computer science or from IS, like you said. I think that was what Abigail said this morning. AI is fundamentally a social technical development paradigm, so we really have to take the social part seriously and not only the computational part of it. And what I think it's a very important discussion to have now and to keep having is exactly who is we that are developing, who are the we's we are developing to, who is the we's who are talking about. So the we question is really a very important one. And AI is, in a sense, can be very inclusive, but can also be very exclusive. And we really need to have that discussion, which is exactly the social part, which is not the computational one, that we have to bring together.
I would agree with all that, but I'd also argue that all of IS is socio-technical as well.
Okay, but maybe even more.
Can I draw a parallel with a different field of science? Last year we published a report on disaster science, so the science around natural disasters, and we contrasted where the research is done with where the impacts of natural disasters are found, and we looked at what the big research nations focus on. And first of all, we saw that the research is not done in the countries most impacted, both if you look at human lives and if you look at economic loss. A lot of South Asia, for instance, springs to mind. Where's the research done? In Europe, in Japan, that's the one where it correlates because of earthquakes, and in the US. And then you look at what do these countries focus on. They focus on the types of disasters that matter most to them. Yeah. A lot of disaster science, especially if you focus on the impacts, is about how do people react. How do we help people out with the choices they make about where they live, with also AI and communication devices, so people can react when there's danger, and how do you build back better, taking into account the real local circumstance. And why am I saying this? Because I think it's relevant to AI as well. A lot of the applications, they are social, so they impact human life, and that isn't the same everywhere. One of the things we've heard when we are now looking at the flows of people also in AI, one of the reasons why people go to the big companies to do their research is access to high performance computing. They have broader ability there, and this is partly a money problem, where rich companies and rich research nations have more money to invest, and therefore they attract better researchers. And if our parallel with disaster science holds true, that has a real implication on for which type of people is held in mind under which circumstances when the solutions are being developed. So that puts a very big responsibility on the researchers doing that.
Did you want to add anything, Cecily, and then we'll go to another
I was
question?
about to say something quite similar, that I think the diversity of people who are building these systems matters a lot. And I don't think we take it seriously. We talk about diversity in technology, we try hard, but I wonder how much do those people who aren't benefiting from these systems understand and have enough self-efficacy to understand that they could change those and build different systems, and do we have a system in place that actually would enable them to get through society to the point where they could do that?
So contextualisation is very important.
Can we go over this side now? We had two questions from here. One of you's been, thank you.
Picking up on Jack's statement on the discredit of democracy around the world, I think I could argue, and I won't do it now because it would take some time, that what's completely discredited and disaster science might help is in representative democracy. Well, people don't want representatives. We probably need to move on to some kind of direct democracy or more direct democracy, do away with representatives. I wonder how artificial intelligence could help us in that space. So turning around your question.
That's my avatar too.
Can I just add that, as a contrast to Paul, is that I don't think there's any democracy in science at all, and I think it is a complete self-delusion that there's any education and research has always been elitist, right from the very beginning, and it's an elitist agenda that gets taught and that gets researched, etc. So democracy is just a big red herring. As is, by the way, fake news.
Can I just ask you to be a bit clearer on, do you say that is the case or that's necessarily the case?
Well, you know, I mean, I would love to change the world in so many different ways. That is the case, and I would like it to see it different, but I don't think it is.
Right.
Okay.
And I don't think I really don't think it's possible to change that much. I mean, I completely agree with the sympathy of what you've been, in sympathy with what you've said, but my goodness, it's so easy to fall into Neil's trap.
Did you notice he pointed at
Trap named after you now.
So can we take the two questions then? The one about democracy doesn't exist at all anyway in education and in research, I assume, and can AI help with a more representational democracy if it does exist? Who'd like to start? Virginia.
Yes, say something answering on the representative democracy and how AI can help on that. One of the main issues that we are seeing now is specifically on representative democracy, but also in other ways of democracy, is the fact that people don't feel represented, and that has a lot to do about the ways that we use to aggregate the individual votes into some decision which then forms a government or whatever. So this type of aggregation methods, and there is a lot of mathematics going around how to aggregate how many people vote for A and how many people vote for B, and then what should be the winning situation. There, I think, is where AI can help, both by analyzing different the results and to provide a scale of possibilities which indicates how how would your government or your parliament or whatever look differently in using different types of aggregation, and also providing people a more direct way to identify and to kind of simulate or to test what would be the possible results by playing in a kind of a sandbox on their own vote and their own opinions, and how to aggregate those different kind of things.
My first point just about democracy would be that, democracy can mean a huge number of things, and let's just accept that sort of interpretive flexibility. But it is part of our political culture, and as with other aspects of our culture, it moves very slowly, and maybe that slowness is a good thing. And maybe if we've learnt something from the last few years of British rapid experiments in democracy, it's be careful what you wish for. The hope that there will be fixes that can be implemented that will sort out political problems that a particular party has got itself in. I think we can learn something from that. And I would say apply that same thinking to any other technological fix that one might apply to difficult political problems. I think there remains the important question of what a genuinely empowering use and development of this technology might be, which takes us to the question of the possibility of democratic innovation. And I agree with the questioner here that, on my more pessimistic moments, I roll out of bed and think, what the fuck am I doing? Right? This isn't a very democratic area, and yet I happen to think that it is possible to imagine democratic alternatives, and I can point to instances where something has gone in a more democratic direction, and I can tell an optimistic story about that. So we've already heard, for example, this morning about the differences between how genetically modified crops was governed from how human fertilization and embryology was governed, in a more democratic, more interdisciplinary, more engaged, more anticipatory way. And I happen to think that, on balance, the outcomes from the latter were better. So I would say there is something to be said for democracy in innovation, but often we're looking for rather dim pools of light in otherwise a rather dark picture.
I'm very sorry that time has gone so fast. I think we could take one more question and then from this lady.
Well, Nicholas Strong, futurist. I had a whole list of very intelligent questions here. And I can conclude that I'm going to do that. I going back to the question I asked before about encouraging young people to think about the future, and that they found it very hard. And my question to them was, what product would you design that hasn't been invented yet in the future? So I'm going to ask you, can you imagine the future? Is this something that only children can't do? And if so, if you can, what product would you design that would be useful to you that hasn't been invented yet?
Interesting question. There we go. You can let your imaginations run, and I assume that means no bounds of plausibility.
No bounds at all.
Yeah.
Go
Okay.
any way you want. You are not limited in any way.
I have lots of answers to your question, and sadly we haven't time. I'd answer the first one just maybe an approach, and then an example of personally what I would build if I had the choice. I think we've been using an inclusive design strategy, and to give for people who aren't familiar, that we have a whole range of abilities in the world, and we start with the view that actually it's not that somebody's body or someone's abilities are somehow inherently inappropriate or wrong, it's just that there's a mismatch between those and the world we live in. And if we think about disability that way, then we can think about the fact that we as technologists can change that world, and we can change the way people interact with things, and we can make sure there's not a mismatch, and therefore there's no longer disability. So if we start out with this perspective, then we say, well then, but what do we design? And sort of the second tenet that we then might work on is to say, well, people with disabilities, or what we functionally call disabilities, often have a different way of being in the world. They have a different way of perceiving the world. They have a different way of interacting, different way of getting stuck in the world than other people have. And often those of us who are on design teams don't generally have these challenges. If we can work with people in these scopes, we can often then start to see the problems that we design in a very different way. And we can start to see solutions for these particular people. But we don't want to necessarily stop and say, well, we want to build you this or build you that. But we can then start to think about, well, how does that then change, think about how we might design for everybody in a completely different way. And to give an example, some of the work that we were doing, computer vision systems, lots of people want to say, well, people can't see, so we're going to build this computer vision system that helps them see. Okay, all we need to do is make a set of eyes, right? You see like this, so I need to build a system like that. But then we can go and work with people who are blind and say, well, actually, what are the challenges that you have? And the challenges generally aren't the fact that they can't see. That's generally not their challenge. The challenge might be that they've sensed one thing, or they sense two conflicting things, and they're not sure which one to go. So actually, their challenge is around sense-making and verification. And then we can say, well, then, how do we enable people to sense, make, and verify in the world? And are there people in other circumstances who aren't blind who have this same problem? We can start to see, well, actually, there are lots of people. There are people on remote calls. There are people who are parents, and they're trying to look at one twin while the other twin is crawling up the wall. You know, there's lots of contexts where we can start to see that this more general problem is something that we can look at. And I think this is a really provocative way to innovate, because it takes us out of the sort of stuck and repetitive way of let me build the same thing over and over again, I'm just going to build it a little bit better, to actually saying, can I think about other things that I might want to solve? So this is a general approach that I think is really, really interesting. If I were to build something just because I decided tomorrow I'm going to build my own thing, what I want, with all the money I want, I would make a different way of doing the way we run clinical trials, and the way we gather data from people, and the way that we enable people to participate in that process. And we see a movement in that space, but we could see a lot more movement in that space.
I have actually, that last thing is almost what I was about to say, actually, because I do a lot of foresight exercises with companies, and what we do is we deliberately have quite provocative things we get them to look at and then respond to. So we don't really do, looking into the crystal ball so much as like what might happen if suddenly all the water disappeared in this country or something like that, and then get them to respond to that and think up ways that their company or their products might be affected by that. And that's been quite an interesting exercise just for me, because a lot of those things I haven't also thought of. But I think that probably what I would create as part of this is a little bit cheeky because it's not so much a thing but a broader thing. I would really like to create an education system that prioritizes critical thinking, and then also methods within society that allows a much broader range of people to actually directly participate in sort of creation and co-creation of science and technology. So not just white middle class people who can afford to take a day off to go do a focus group somewhere, but actually people from all the stratas of society to actually be able to come together and create something that benefits everybody, not just not just one group of people, basically.
So my first thought was what my 7-year-old inventor to be would say, but that would be something with a dinosaur spaceship somewhere. With all the advances in mobile technology, we're using more and more electricity, and the climate impact of that and the use of natural resources from the entire digital industry surpasses that of many big nations by now. So what I would like to invent is a way to get the climate impact reversed.
Okay, yeah, I would like to invent artificial intelligence.
The real one! That's why I'm here!
The one who doesn't need all the energy? Who doesn't need 10 million images of a cat to understand what a cat is? Which doesn't need to keep all that data in all those data centers which use all that energy, and which is not only about cognition, but is about human intelligence in all its facets, emotions, social aspects, ethics, whatever else. So the real thing. I think we are very far from that one, if we ever get there.
So we had no constraints?
No constraints.
Okay, so I don't know what it's called, but it's a clever piece of physics. And those of you that remember the Prince of Persia on PlayStation 2 that will know that whenever anything went wrong, you had this little voice that said, "Oh no, that didn't happen." And you went back to something. And I would just like the ability to chase down all of the opportunities and possibilities and enjoy all of them.
Okay, sounds good. Jack, do you have anything you want to add at the end?
No, I mean, my serious, rather boring point is that I typically think that when it comes to technology, there's rather too much thinking about the future by a small group of people. They are a small group of people that privilege their own views, and they privilege technological invention over social innovation. It was interesting that the first two here were social innovations, not technological ones. So my invention is a bullshit detector.
Thank you very much. Okay, I'd really like, please put your hands together to thank the panel.